told that the 16 to 8 fasting ratio was the safe one, the gentle one, the one you could do forever to protect your heart, sharpen your brain, slow aging. But the data from the last 12 months says something different. In a study of more than 33,000 US adults, the people eating in a window under 8 hours a day had 34% higher all-cause mortality risk than the people eating across an 11 to 13-hour window. The safest eating window for most adults sits around 11 to 12 hours, not 8. If you have been doing 16 to 8 ratio for 2 years and feel worse, not better, this is the episode I definitely want you to hear. I'm Dr. Shad Abdulla. I'm a naturopathic doctor and the founder of Blue Yarrow. And this is a show where I take a piece of research that the wellness world has already simplified into a slogan and put it back into its actual shape. So today is all about chrononutrition, the science of when you eat, not just what you eat. And by the end of this episode, you'll know 3 things. One is that what the new mortality data on time-restricted eating actually says, including the U-shaped curve almost no one is talking about yet. And 2, why an isocaloric 8-hour window did not improve insulin sensitivity in a recent trial of women with overweight, and what that tells you about whether timing alone is the layer. 3, what an 11 to 12-hour eating window looks like in real life and how to know whether you are one of the people for whom even that is too aggressive right now. And one quick note before I get into it, show notes and full script and a deep dive blog version of this can be found at blueyarrow.org. So save them or come back to them after the episode. The blog has every study I'm citing, so if you're interested in that, definitely check it out. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Intermittent fasting, as the wellness world talks about it, is mostly one protocol, mostly. It is a 16 to 8 hour ratio. So eat in an 8-hour window and fast for 16. That window has been sold to women in their 30s and 40s as the gentle introductory version. The one that supposedly costs you nothing and gives you metabolic flexibility, autophagy, sharper cognition, lower inflammation, slower aging. If you have ever opened Instagram, you have heard some version of this, and the appeal is real because it is a structured rule. One rule: close the window at 8 p.m. and open it at noon. And you do not have to think about food in between. Here's the thing though. The data that built that narrative is almost entirely short-term, mostly mixed sex, mostly in adults with overweight or obesity, and mostly 4 to 12 weeks long. The long-term randomized trials in regularly cycling women aged around 30 to 45 does not really exist, or if it does, it's very minuscule. The long-term randomized trials in women in perimenopause also in the same boat. Very little evidence, if any. And the clinical promise was extrapolated from data that did not include the people the promise was sold to. So, what is actually available? In the last 24 months, 3 shifts in the literature have landed that the wellness industry has not yet caught up with as much as I like to see. So shift 1, in 2025, a research group published an analysis in the journal Aging Cell using the NHANES database. So this is a large nationally represented US health survey, and this analysis followed more than 33,000 adults for a median of 8 years. The researchers, led by Mao and colleagues, looked at the relationship between habitual eating window and all-cause mortality. And what they found was not a straight line, it was a U-curve. The lowest mortality risk sat in the 11 to 12-hour range. People eating in a window of less than 8 hours per day had a 34% higher all-cause mortality risk than people in the 12 to 13-hour reference window. People eating in a window of 15 hours or more had 25% higher all-cause mortality risk, which is what you would expect from late-night eating patterns, right? Now, the interesting half of that curve is actually the short end. The 8-hour or less group was the group everyone assumed was protected. Now, I want to slow down here because I think the way most people will hear that number is wrong. They will hear 34% high mortality and maybe panic, right? That is not what I want you to take from this. The meta-analysis is observational. It is built on two 24-hour dietary recalls used to define each person's habitual eating window. So that's only 2 days. That's not a perfect instrument. People who eat in under 8 hours on those 2 recall days might be sicker to begin with, right? So they might have cancer or anorexia or aging or food insecurity or be in active illness, which would compress their eating and also raise their mortality independently. This is what researchers call reverse causation. Sick people eating in shorter windows because they're sick, not because the short window made them sick. So a serious skeptic, and there are good ones in the chrononutrition research community, would tell you that the entire 34% could be confounding. And here's why I still take this finding seriously though. Because the practical implication of the U-curve is not fasting will kill you. It is the sweet spot is 11 to 12 hours, not 8. That recommendation is pretty conservative. It is harm neutral. It aligns with the federal chrononutrition consensus from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute workshop published in 2025, which endorsed earlier eating, regular timing, and the avoidance of late night eating. It aligns with the American Heart Association 2017 meal timing statement. So the U-curve does not stand alone. It sits in the middle of a converging body of evidence that the wellness industry has skipped past on its way to selling the 16 to 8 hour ratio as the universal answer for every single one. Now, shift 2. In 2025, a German group led by Peters and Pivovarova-Ramich published a randomized crossover trial in Science Translation Medicine, and 31 women with overweight or obesity. Each woman did an isocaloric early time restricted eating from 8 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and an isocaloric late time restricted eating from 1 in the afternoon to 9 at night. And that was done 2 weeks per group. So the isocaloric, meaning the calories were matched. The point of the trial was to ask the question, if you take calories out of the picture, does timing alone do anything for cardiometabolic health? And they found that the answer was no. Insulin sensitivity did not improve in either group. 24-hour glucose lipid inflammatory markers, oxidative stress markers, none of them really moved for that group. There was a small weight loss in both groups, slightly larger in the early eating one, but that was attributed to a slight unintentional caloric deficit, not to a timing effect. The early group shifted circadian phase earlier, and the late group shifted circadian phase later. Those are the real chronobiology effects, but they did not translate into a cardiometabolic benefit at the time frame and intensity that the study was done for. So an isocaloric 8-hour eating window did not improve insulin sensitivity in women with overweight over 2 weeks. So if you're eating the same calories you were eating before, just compressed into an 8-hour window, the timing alone is not buying you the metabolic transformation that you were promised. The mechanism story, the BMAL1 and clock and cry-clock genes, the circadian alignment, and the morning insulin sensitivity. All of that is real biology. It is well established. It just does not translate cleanly into clinical benefit at the doses most women are practicing. Shift number 3, there is a Cochrane review that came out of in pre-publication form in early 2026, where 22 trials around 2,000 adults with overweight or obesity, and the review found that intermittent fasting did not produce more weight loss than standard diet advice. The lead author was quoted saying, "Intermittent fasting just does not seem to work for adults with overweight and obesity trying to lose weight." This review is one of the more rigorous evidence synthesis organization in the field. So when it lands on the entire framing of an intervention has to be re-examined. The result is pending full publication at the moment, so I'm holding this at a moderate confidence until the paper finally drops. But the direction of evidence is definitely consistent. So putting those 3 shifts that I talked about, the U-curve mortality signal, the isocaloric null in women, and the Cochrane null on the weight, none of these say fasting is dangerous. They say fasting as it is currently being practiced and marketed is not delivering the outcomes that it was sold on, including in the population mostly likely to be doing this, which is women. And I want to flag a piece of context here that I think gets lost in the noise. The mechanism story for why time-restricted eating should work has very beautiful biology. There is a heterodimer of 2 proteins. So, BMAL1 and clock that binds to regulatory regions of hundreds of genes in your liver, your fat, your muscles. It drives a daily rhythm of the gene expression that is turned to when you eat. So when you eat at unpredictable times across 16 hours, that rhythm gets blunted. And when you eat in a more compressed and consistent window, the rhythm is sharpened. The Salk Institute group led by Sachin Panda has shown it repeatedly in animal models and confirmed in peripheral tissue studies in humans as well. So your morning insulin sensitivity is higher than your evening insulin sensitivity. Your pancreas is more efficient when you eat earlier in the day, and all of that is in the literature that the wellness world has correctly identified, but maybe incorrectly translated that identification. So the translation problem is the gap between the mechanism and the clinical outcomes that people are seeing. So just because eating earlier matches your biology a little bit better, that does not mean an 8-hour window is the optimal way to capture that benefit. The benefit looks like it lives in a much gentler shift. So eat earlier rather than later. Stop eating before sleep. Hold an 11 to 12-hour window. That is most of what the mechanism predicts you can capture in a real human life. So pushing past it into 6 or 8 hours as the cost of restriction without buying you any more benefit, and in fact might be hurting you. Now the question I get asked a lot, especially by women, is, okay, so what window should I be in? And before I answer that, I want to set up segment 2 with the most useful framing I have on this. So here's the pattern, and I have seen this in so many cases I have reviewed that I can almost predict the timing. A woman in her late 30s starts the 16 to 8-hour ratio fasting. Maybe her doctor mentioned it, maybe her friends lost weight on it, maybe she heard a podcast about autophagy and longevity. Whatever the trigger was, the first 6 weeks are definitely remarkable. You know, this may have increased her energy, it may have cleared her brain fog, bloating goes down, she loses 3 or 4 pounds even without trying too hard. She might be sleeping better for the first 2 weeks. Maybe her clothes fit a little bit better. And she tells everyone that she found a thing. And then around week 6 or 7, some of that change starts to drift. The energy is not quite there in the afternoons. She might be hungrier at dinner. Her workouts feel a little bit harder, like her legs are made of concrete. Maybe hair in the shower drain is noticeably more, maybe even more hair fall. There may be some changes to her period cycle. And maybe her sleep starts to fragment, wake up 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, alert, maybe a little bit anxious, and just cannot go back down to sleep. She might even be bloated, but differently this time. And she might tell herself she just needs more discipline. She has read the book, she knows the rules, she's not that kind of woman who quits and just gives up, right? But the crash comes around 4 months usually. The weight starts coming back faster than it may have even left her. Her cycles might be longer even. Or she might be tired, exhausted. And then going to her primary care doctor's labs are normal. TSH is in range, fasting glucose is fine, cholesterol is even better. She's told she's fine. In many of these cases that I've reviewed, the woman starts to believe her body's broken. And I just want to tell you, it's not broken. The protocol is wrong for her. When you compress eating into an 8-hour window, 2 things happen that are not obvious from outside the body. The first is that protein intake quietly collapses, right? We may not be eating the same amount of protein that we used to. Most women on 16 to the 8 ratio of fasting are eating 2, maybe 1 meal a day and maybe a snack to pre-meal protein dose that drives most of protein synthesis. And most women I've seen tracking their food during this time are nowhere near the recommended protein intake. Maybe they're eating 15, 18, 20 grams a meal, even if that, and they are losing a lot of lean mass without realizing it. Now, lean mass loss is invisible on just a regular scale that you have. It just looks like weight loss, but it is hollowing them out. And by month 4, when the weight comes back, it comes back as fat mass on a smaller frame, and they're weaker than they were when they started. The second thing is that prolonged daily energy restriction in cycling women interacts with the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis in a way that the wellness world is not flagging. There is a population of neurons in the hypothalamus that secretes a peptide called kisspeptin. Kisspeptin is the pulse generator for the entire reproductive cascade, and when energy availability drops, when the body senses that it is in a state of restriction, kisspeptin pulsatility slows down, and that cascades into reduced GnRH, reduced LH, lower ovarian estrogen and progesterone, and this is the mechanism behind functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, a condition where a woman stops cycling because her body has decided this is not a safe time to ovulate. And this is a very well established mechanism, but what is not well established is the dose. There is not much, if any, randomized trial showing exactly how many weeks of this type of fasting at what level of caloric intake produces clinically meaningful kisspeptin suppression in a woman living in her 30s. That trial has not been run yet, or if it has been, I have not come across it. But the mechanism is real, and the clinical pattern that I have seen across cases definitely lines up with this. The pattern I have seen is that the women who feel best on fasting are not the ones with the shortest windows. They're the ones whose last bite maybe is even at 6 p.m., right? Or 7, and whose body got a real overnight rest. So I think using the 16 to 8 hour ratio as a tool with a short life for most cycling women, we can use it short term, useful for 1 to 3 months as a metabolic reset. And similar to how I think about short-term calorie tracking. So it's useful to break up a pattern, useful to drop that water weight before, clinical reassessment. But the literature says that this may not be something useful for as a lifestyle, as a lifelong practice, especially for women. And it might be doing harm to their longevity rather than helping them. And it's definitely not useful for hormones, especially if the woman is under eating and not meeting her dietary requirements in that 8-hour window. The reason why this recommendation is so common is that it's sold to many women. I feel like a lot of women, especially when they're high functioning achievers, they already have the discipline and already used to suppressing her body signal to perform at work, raise her kids, be the one. So the protocol rewards that posture for 6 weeks, and then, the bill comes due, right? This is the population in which I think the harm signal is most credible, not because there's even research to prove it, but because the mechanism, the clinical pattern, and the audience's emotional language all converge, right? So I got this question a while back from someone, and they said, if the 16 to 8 hour ratio is too aggressive for me, am I one of the people who should not fast at all? And I think the answer to that is no. Just from my studies and the research, there is a difference between aggressive fasting and circadian aligned eating. The second one is what the evidence actually supports in most adults, and that is the framework I'm going to give you in the next segment. So if you wake at 6:30 and have your first food at 7, your last bite should land somewhere around 7 in the evening to give you a 12-hour overnight gap and put your dinner 2 to 3 hours before sleep. Eating 2 to 3 hours before bed is one of the most validated chrononutrition moves in the literature at the moment. It's also in the AHA meal timing scientific statement from 2017. Pretty much in every chrononutrition review I have read this year. And also remember that protein matters a lot. If you take one window shape change from this episode, take this protein point next to it, okay? At each of your meal, aim to have at least 0.4 grams per kilogram of your weight. So for most women in the audience, that lands around maybe 25 to 35 grams of protein a meal. And if you're doing a 12-hour window with 3 meals, that is pretty achievable. All right, so let me bring it all together. The most useful reframe of intermittent fasting in 2026 is not that fasting is good or bad. It is that there is a U-shaped curve, and the safest position on that curve is not at the extreme. 11 to 12 hours of eating with a clear 2 to 3 hour gap before sleep captures most of the cardiometabolic benefit the evidence actually supports. 8-hour windows are a short-term metabolic tool, not a lifestyle. Less than 8 hours carries a real mortality signal in observational data and a clinical pattern in cycling women that I have seen play out repeatedly. The wellness story was incomplete, and the real story is much gentler, more practical, and definitely more useful. So what I want you to understand is that the protocol you're doing is not the only variable. The deeper variable is whether your body on this particular weak in this particular season of your life can metabolically afford the restriction you are asking of it. A 33-year-old woman without stress, without training 6 days a week, without regular sleep, adequate protein, may do beautifully on a 10-hour window. But somebody else who may be going through menopause, working full time, their sleep is they're training hard, their health may decline dramatically on this type of protocol. So your one homework is this week, do one thing. Set a single time at which you finish eating. Pick it based on when you go to bed and subtract 2 to 3 hours. That is your finishing time. Make it the same time every day. You do not have to change anything else. You do not have to shorten your window. You just have to stop eating at the same time every night, 2 to 3 hours before bed. Now, the hardest part of this episode is not the data. It is the part where you have to let go of a story that worked for you briefly and then stopped working. That story is hard to let go of because the first 6 weeks were really good, and because somebody you trusted told you that the protocol was the answer. I want you to remember that the protocol was a tool that captured a real piece of your biology for a short window of time, and you don't need that tool anymore. You're causing your body more harm than good potentially doing this. And like always, this content is for educational purposes only, and it's not medical advice. So please consult with your healthcare provider for very individualized recommendations. All right, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something from it. I would love to hear your comments, your opinions. So please feel free to leave that. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.